Welcome to the Fear Files channel. Today we will dive into one of the darkest pages of human history, an event that forever changed perceptions of religious cults and mind control. This is the story of Jonestown, about the final hours of more than 900 people, and about that final audio recording that captured the moment of collective tragedy. Prepare yourself for a journey into the depths of human madness and despair. November 18th, 1978. The dense jungles of Guyana, a remote settlement created by an American religious organization called People's Temple. It was here, in a place that was supposed to become a utopia, a paradise on earth, that one of the largest tragedies in U.S. history before the events of September 11th occurred. 909 people died within a few hours. Among them were more than 300 children. To understand how this became possible, we need to go back to the beginning of the story of People's Temple and its founder, Jim Jones. This charismatic preacher was born in 1931 in a small town in Indiana. From an early age, he showed an interest in religion, but he was attracted not so much by spirituality as by power over people. Neighbors remembered a strange boy who conducted funeral ceremonies for dead animals and forced other children to attend these rituals. In the 50s, Jones founded his church in Indianapolis. He was an unusual preacher for that time, preaching racial equality in the era of segregation. His congregation accepted both whites and blacks, which attracted many idealists and those seeking social justice. Jones knew how to say the right words, find society's pain points, and offer solutions. He was a brilliant orator, capable of holding an audience in suspense for hours. But behind the facade of social activism lurked something darker. Jones gradually began to use methods of mind control, isolating followers from the outside world, creating an atmosphere of constant external threat. He convinced his followers that only he could protect them from a hostile world, from the government, from nuclear war, which, according to him, was inevitable. In the 70s, when criticism of People's Temple intensified, Jones made the decision to relocate. First to California, to San Francisco, where the organization reached the peak of its influence, numbering thousands of followers. Jones established connections with politicians, participated in public life. His temple was known for charity. But inside the community, completely different rules prevailed. Followers gave all their property to the temple, worked practically for free, were subjected to cruel punishments for the slightest disobedience. Jones held so-called cathartic sessions where he publicly humiliated community members, forced them to confess to sins they had not committed, created an atmosphere of total fear and submission. He instilled in followers that he would betray them if they tried to leave, that their families would be in danger. Gradually, Jones began to introduce the idea of revolutionary suicide. He conducted drills, which he called white nights. In the middle of the night, he would wake all members of the community with an alarm signal, declare that they were being attacked by enemies, that the only way to preserve dignity was to die together. People were given liquid which, they were told, had been poisoned. Then Jones would announce that this was a loyalty test. Thus, he accustomed his followers to the idea of collective death. When journalists and former temple members began to publicly accuse the organization of abuse, Jones understood that his empire was under threat. In 1977, he made a decision that determined the fate of hundreds of people. He moved the majority of the community to the jungles of Guyana in South America, where they founded a settlement called Jonestown. This was supposed to be a socialist utopia, a place where they could live by their own rules, far from hostile capitalist society. In reality, Jonestown became a concentration camp. The settlement was surrounded by jungle. The nearest town was hours away. Followers worked from dawn to dusk in unbearable heat and humidity, receiving minimal nutrition. Passports were confiscated. Escapes were practically impossible. Jones established a system of total control, surrounding himself with armed guards. Loudspeakers broadcast his voice around the clock, even at night. People slept 4 to 5 hours, were exhausted physically and mentally. Jones intensified the white nights. Now they happened more often, and each time the threat seemed more real. He convinced followers that the U.S. government wanted to destroy them, that the CIA was preparing an attack, that the only way to defeat enemies was to die with dignity, refusing to submit. By the fall of 1978, the situation reached a critical point. Relatives of temple members in the U.S. organized a group that demanded an investigation. Congressman Leo Ryan decided to personally visit Jonestown to check complaints about human rights violations. This became the last straw for Jones. On November 17, 1978, Leo Ryan arrived in Jonestown with a group of journalists and relatives of temple members. At first, the visit seemed successful. Jones put on a show, demonstrating how happy his followers were. But in the evening, several community members secretly asked Ryan to help them leave. When this became known, the atmosphere changed sharply. On November 18th, when Ryan's group was preparing to leave the settlement along with several defectors, armed guards of Jones attacked them on the airstrip. Congressman Ryan was killed along with 3 journalists and 1 defector. Several people were wounded. This was an act that made turning back impossible. Jones understood that now everything was over. The murder of a congressman meant that the authorities would definitely intervene, that he would be arrested, that the temple would be destroyed. He gathered all the residents of Jonestown and announced that the time had come for revolutionary suicide. Time for that act of resistance. He had been preparing them for years. And here begins that very recording. 45 minutes of audio that captured the final moments of Jonestown. Jones turned on the tape recorder, possibly hoping that this recording would become his message to the world, proof that they died as heroes, not as victims of a mad leader. On the recording, Jones's voice can be heard, tired but still full of determination. He tells his followers that they have no choice, that after Ryan's murder, they will all be arrested, their children will be taken away, they will be tortured. He describes nightmare scenarios of what awaits them if they remain alive. His voice sounds alternately pleading, then threatening. You can hear people crying, children screaming. Someone tries to object. One woman, Christine Miller, finds the courage to ask whether they couldn't find another way out. Maybe flee to the USSR, a country Jones had always praised. But Jones rejects her suggestion, claiming there's nowhere to run, that they're surrounded by enemies. In the background, you can hear the voices of other temple leaders who support Jones, urge the rest not to fear death, say that it will be quick and painless, that they will simply fall asleep and wake up in a better world. This is an eerie cacophony of manipulation and despair. Nurses had already begun to prepare the poison. It was cyanide mixed with grape-flavored drink. First, they poisoned the children. Parents were told this was necessary, that children should not suffer. Mothers gave poison to their infants from syringes, pouring the deadly liquid directly into their mouths. Children died in convulsions within a few minutes. The screams and crying of children are audible on the recording. This is one of the most heartbreaking elements of this document. After the children came the turn of adults. People lined up in a queue, received a paper cup with poison, and drank it. Some went voluntarily, convinced by Jones's speeches that this was the only dignified way out. Others were terrified, but could not resist, surrounded by armed guards and crowd pressure. Jones continues to speak, his voice becoming increasingly impatient. He hurries people, says they have little time, that enemies are already close. He calls for dying with dignity, without tears and fear. He calls it an act of revolutionary courage, a protest against an unjust world. On the recording, you can hear Jones repeating again and again, "Die with dignity." His voice rises to a shout, then falls to a whisper. He addresses people by name, calls on them not to hesitate. "Mother, mother, mother, please," he says, addressing the elderly women of the community. "Lay the burden on the leader. I take all responsibility. This was my decision. But this is a lie, and it's audible on the recording." People did not want to die. The screams become louder. Someone tries to run into the jungle, but guards stop them. Jones becomes more aggressive in his exhortations. He tells those who doubt that they are traitors, that they are weaklings, that they are destroying the final act of resistance. "Stop this crying and moaning," he shouts. "Death is just a transition to another place. It's not scary. Death is our friend." His words sound increasingly insane, but around him a core of devoted followers continues to support him, drowning out the voices of dissenters. One of the women on the recording screams, "I'm not ready to die," but her voice is quickly lost in the general chaos. The system that Jones had created over the years was working even in this final hour. People who could have rebelled were too intimidated, too exhausted, too brainwashed to organize resistance. The temple's medical personnel moved between the dying, checking pulses, making sure the poison had worked. Those who drank the poison began writhing in agony almost immediately. Cyanide causes a horrible death, suffocation, convulsions, foam from the mouth. This was not the peaceful falling asleep that Jones had promised. This was an agonizing death. The pavilion territory was turning into a scene from hell. Bodies began to fall one after another. People clutched their throats, their bodies convulsed. The smell of cyanide, similar to bitter almonds, mixed with the smell of vomit and excrement. Survivors later recounted that the sound were the most horrible, the gasps of the dying, the screams of children, the lamentations of mothers. On the recording, Jones continues his monologue. Now, there is a strange euphoria in his voice. He talks about how they will go down in history, how their act will be remembered forever. "We are not committing suicide," he insists. "This is a revolutionary act. We refuse to submit to tyranny." But his words are empty. This was not a political act. This was mass murder disguised as ideology. Jones knew this. At one point on the recording, his mask slips, and you can hear him tell one of his assistants, "Get the suitcase." The suitcase with money. Until the last moment, he was thinking about escaping, leaving his followers to die. Time on the recording drags painfully slowly. You can hear someone playing guitar, try to create some semblance of a calm atmosphere. Someone sings a hymn. But these attempts at normalcy sound grotesque against the background of the nightmare happening. Jones begins to lose control of his voice. He sounds increasingly drunk, though it's unclear whether from drugs or from awareness of the scale of what he has done. He mumbles something about how they will all meet on the other side, that their death will have meaning. Gradually, the screams become quieter. More and more people lie dead. The pavilion is filled with bodies. They lie on top of each other. Mothers embrace their children for the last time. Some families died together, holding hands. This is the only manifestation of humanity in this absolute madness. Toward the end of the recording, far fewer voices are heard. Jones is still talking, but his words become incoherent. He repeats the same thing again and again, like a broken record. "It was beautiful," he says. "We did it beautifully." Then the recording cuts off. The last minutes are not recorded. We don't know exactly how Jim Jones himself died. When Guyana authorities arrived at the scene the next day, they found his body with a gunshot wound to the head. Next to him lay his personal nurse, also shot. Perhaps he committed suicide. Perhaps someone else killed him. The truth was never established. The scene that rescuers discovered was beyond comprehension. 909 bodies, decomposed in the tropical heat. Bodies of children, infants in their mother's arms. Elderly people, teenagers, adults, all dead. The colorful clothes of temple members created an eerie contrast with the gray deadness of skin. But there were survivors. Several people managed to escape into the jungle when the poisoning began. They spent the night in terror, listening to the screams of the dying, not knowing whether Jones's guards were pursuing them. Their testimonies helped reconstruct the complete picture of what happened. One of the survivors, a woman named Odell Rhodes, hid under a house and watched everything through cracks in the floor. She saw how people lined up for death. She saw how guards with weapons stood around the perimeter, not letting anyone leave. She saw how children died. These images haunted her for the rest of her life. Another survivor, Stanley Clayton, pretended to be dead, lying among the bodies, and then escaped into the jungle. He recounted that in the final minutes, he saw some of Jones's closest associates walking among the bodies, checking whether everyone was dead, and finishing off those who were still breathing. This is an important detail. Jonestown was not entirely a voluntary act. Yes, many people drank the poison themselves, convinced or intimidated. But there were those who were forced. There were those who were held by force and had poison poured down their throats. There were those who were shot when they tried to flee. Autopsies showed that some victims had marks of forcible poison injection by syringes in the back parts of their bodies. The investigation after the tragedy revealed the scale of Jones's manipulations. Recordings of all his sermons were found, documents showing the temple's financial machinations. Millions of dollars that followers had given to the organization disappeared. Evidence of physical and sexual abuse was found. Jones raped both men and women from his community, claiming it was part of spiritual practice. Evidence was found of how Jones falsified miracles. He staged healings, planting people in the audience who would then miraculously recover. He pulled cancer tumors out of people, which were actually chicken giblets. All his religious charisma was built on deception. Psychologists have studied the phenomenon of Jonestown for decades, trying to understand how rational people could reach such a point. The answer lies in the gradual escalation of control. Jones did not start by demanding they die for him. He started small donations, attending additional services. Then demands grew gradually, so gradually that people did not notice how they were losing their freedom. This is called the commitment shift technique. When a person has already made a small sacrifice, it is psychologically easier for them to make a larger one. When they have already given a little money, it's easier to give all savings. When they have already moved to another state for the temple, it's easier to move to another country. And when they have already participated in suicide rehearsals, real suicide seems just the next logical step. Jones also used isolation. He destroyed family ties, forcing followers to call him father and themselves brothers and sisters. He encouraged informing on each other, creating an atmosphere of distrust. No one could be sure that their neighbor wouldn't tell the leaders about their doubts. He controlled information. In Jonestown, there was no radio, newspapers, television. The only source of news was Jones himself, and he painted a picture of a world descending into chaos, where only his community remained an island of safety. People did not know what was really happening in the outside world. He deprived people of sleep and normal nutrition. An exhausted, sleep-deprived person is more susceptible to manipulation, less capable of critical thinking. Constant physical work in tropical heat conditions pushed people to their limit. And most importantly, he used fear. Fear of the outside world, fear of punishment within the community, fear of losing the only support and meaning of life. For many temple members, especially those who joined escaping from poverty, racism, or personal problems, the community was all they had. To lose it meant returning to the life they had fled from. After Jonestown, the world changed its attitude toward cults. Organizations appeared to help people exit destructive groups. Laws were passed strengthening control over religious organizations. Relatives of victims created support groups, helping each other cope with trauma. But the most important lesson of Jonestown is a lesson about the nature of power and submission, about how a charismatic leader can turn idealism into an instrument of destruction, about how the desire to belong to something greater can be used against us, about how important it is to maintain critical thinking and connections with the outside world. That recording, those 45 minutes of audio, remains one of the most chilling documents of human history. Listening to it is almost impossible. The voices of children, the crying of mothers, Jones's insane speeches. All this creates a portrait of absolute evil disguised as care and love. Many researchers, journalists, and historians have tried to analyze every second of this recording, trying to find the moment when everything could still have been stopped. But the truth is that this moment came much earlier, years earlier, when Jones was just beginning to build his empire of control. By November 18th, 1978, the machine was already running on autopilot, and stopping it was virtually impossible. There are moments in the recording that are especially difficult to listen to. One of them is when you can hear the voice of a small boy crying and saying he doesn't want to die. His mother tries to calm him, saying it will be like sleep, that he will simply fall asleep. Her voice trembles. You can hear the horror in it, but she continues to comfort the child, even knowing that she is leading him to death. This is maternal instinct, perverted and directed in a monstrous direction. Jones used children as a weapon against their parents. He knew that many adults could have rebelled, could have refused to die. But when their children were poisoned first, when mothers held dying infants in their arms, they had no reason left to live. The psychological torture of watching one's own child die broke the last resistance of many people. On the recording, you can hear one of the women screaming at Jones, "You killed my child." But her voice is quickly drowned out. Perhaps she was led away by force. Perhaps forced to be silent. We will never know her name, never know what happened to her in the next minutes. She became one of the nameless voices of the tragedy. Interestingly, Jones throughout the recording tries to maintain the illusion of choice. He constantly talks about our decision, about how we chose this path. But this is a classic manipulative technique. When a person is surrounded by armed guards, when their child is already dead, when everyone around is dying, what choice do they have left? Jones created the illusion of agency where there was none. Some psychologists call this learned helplessness. When a person repeatedly faces situations where their actions don't matter, where they cannot control the outcome, they stop trying. Years of life in People's Temple, where any disobedience was cruelly punished, where escape attempts ended in public humiliation and physical punishment, taught people not to resist. There were also those who resisted to the end. Autopsies showed that some people had signs of struggle, scratches, bruises, marks from being held. There were people who were literally forced to drink poison. There were those who were shot when they tried to break out of the crowd and run into the jungle. One of the temple guards who survived because he was in another location at the moment of mass suicide later recounted that he received orders to shoot anyone who tried to leave the pavilion. He said that several people really did try to flee and they were killed. Their bodies were then placed with the rest to create the impression that everyone died voluntarily. This is an important part of the narrative Jones was trying to create even in the final minutes. He wanted the world to see this as an act of mass heroism, as a political statement. He recorded everything on tape precisely for this purpose, to leave his version of history. But the reality captured in the screams and crying on this recording tells a completely different story. By the middle of the recording, the atmosphere begins to change. The initial chaos, screams, arguments, all this subsides, simply because more and more people are dying. You can hear Jones notice this, and his voice becomes almost triumphant. "See how quiet it is," he says. "See how peaceful. They have fallen asleep. They are free." But this was not freedom. This was death, agonizing and terrible. Cyanide kills by blocking cells' ability to use oxygen. A person suffocates from the inside, even while breathing. This is agony that can last from several minutes to half an hour, depending on the dose. Many victims of Jonestown died slowly, in suffering. The medical team that first arrived at the scene was traumatized for life. One of the doctors recounted that the most terrible thing was the number of children. Small bodies dressed in bright clothes lay in groups. Some still held toys. Infants lay in strollers or in their mother's arms. It was like a kindergarten after some unimaginable catastrophe. The process of identifying bodies took weeks. Many people were so decomposed due to the tropical heat that it was impossible to identify them. Dental records and fingerprints were used, but for many victims, no names were ever found. They remained nameless, buried in mass graves. Relatives of victims faced unimaginable trauma. Many of them had spent years trying to extract their loved ones from the temple, sent letters, appealed to authorities. Now they blamed themselves, thinking they could have done more. Some families were completely destroyed. Entire families died in Jonestown, leaving no one to mourn them. The American government also bore responsibility. There were investigations that showed numerous complaints about People's Temple were ignored. Politicians who received support from the temple turned a blind eye to abuses. When Congressman Ryan finally decided to act, it was already too late. After Jonestown, the term "drinking the Kool-Aid" appeared, which means blindly following someone, even in self-destructive actions. This expression entered mass culture, but many find it offensive. It simplifies a complex tragedy, turning it into a metaphor, and ignores the fact that many victims did not choose their death. Actually, in Jonestown, they used not Kool-Aid, but another drink, Flavor Aid. But the name stuck. This shows how quickly the real details of tragedy blur, turning into a cultural meme, losing their real human essence. The recording ends with strange silence. You can only hear individual sounds, someone's cough, footsteps, perhaps of the last surviving members of Jones's inner circle. Then just the noise of the tape. The tape recorder continued to work for some time, recording the silence of death. When authorities found this recording, they debated for a long time whether to make it public. In the end, they decided that the public had the right to know the truth. But the recording was edited. The most horrific moments, children's screams, were cut out for the initial public release. The full version only became available years later. Those who have listened to the full recording describe it as a consciousness-changing experience. It is impossible to hear these voices, these last words of hundreds of people, and remain the same. This is a reminder of what humans are capable of in terms of evil, manipulation, and blind obedience. Jim Jones was not a unique monster. History is full of similar figures, charismatic leaders who used idealism and fear to control people. What makes Jonestown special is the scale of the tragedy and the fact that it was so thoroughly documented. This recording became a warning, but the question is whether we heard it. After Jonestown, there were other cults, other tragedies. Branch Davidians in Waco, Heaven's Gate, Aum Shinrikyo in Japan. Each time the same techniques are used: isolation, information control, creating an image of a hostile outside world, gradual escalation of demands. And each time people are found who are vulnerable to these techniques. What makes a person vulnerable to cults? Research shows it's not a question of intelligence or education. Many members of People's Temple were educated people, teachers, nurses, social workers. They joined because they were seeking meaning, community, a way to make the world better. Jones offered them exactly that, or at least the illusion of it. He talked about racial equality in an era when it was a radical idea. He created programs to help the poor. He offered an alternative to what many saw as a corrupt and unjust society. For many, the temple was not a cult, but a social justice movement. This is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to identify dangerous groups in the early stages. They begin with noble goals, with attractive ideas. Only gradually, almost imperceptibly, do they turn into instruments of control and exploitation. By the time people realize something is wrong, they are already too deeply involved to easily exit. Families of Jonestown victims created organizations that still work to prevent similar tragedies. They developed signs by which one can recognize a destructive cult, demanding absolute obedience to the leader, financial exploitation, breaking ties with family and friends outside the group, punishment for critical thinking, creating an atmosphere of constant crisis. But the problem is that these signs are not always obvious from the outside. A person inside such a group does not see the manipulation. For them, it is simply dedication to a cause, sacrifice for higher goals. Jones was a master at renaming control as care, exploitation as service, isolation as protection. There is a moment on the recording when Jones says, "I love you all more than you can imagine." And perhaps in some perverted form, he really believed that. Narcissistic leaders often confuse love with possession. For Jones, his followers were an extension of himself, and their death was his final act of control over them. Psychologists who studied Jones's personality diagnosed him with a whole spectrum of disorders: narcissistic personality disorder, paranoia, megalomania, possibly psychopathy. By the end, his drug addiction was so strong that he could barely function without them. He took huge doses of barbiturates and amphetamines, which only intensified his paranoia and mania. In the final months before the tragedy, Jones was physically destroyed. Witnesses described him as a shadow of his former charismatic leader, emaciated, with trembling hands, speaking incoherently. But the system he created worked even without his full participation. His closest assistants took on many management functions, but none of them dared challenge him. This is another important aspect of cult dynamics, creating a hierarchy where those closer to the leader receive privileges and power over the rest. These people become invested in the system because they lose the most when it collapses. Many of Jones's closest associates died in Jonestown, but some survived, being in other places at the moment of mass suicide. These surviving leaders faced incredible guilt and public anger. Some of them still insist that Jones was initially a good person who lost his way. Others acknowledge their role in the tragedy and have dedicated their lives to warning others about the dangers of cults. One of them, a woman who was one of Jones's main assistants, later wrote memoirs describing her path from idealistic young activist to accomplice of a tyrant. She told how each small compromise, each justification of violence for the higher cause led her deeper in a moral abyss. By the time she realized she was participating in something monstrous, escape seemed impossible. Her story shows that evil rarely comes in obvious form. It comes gradually, masquerading as good, as necessity, as sacrifice for others. This is the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt wrote about. Ordinary people committing monstrous things because the system normalized them. On the recording of Jonestown's final minutes, you hear precisely this. People participating in the murder of children, but using the language of love and care. It doesn't hurt, they tell the children, pouring poison into them. We will all be together. They turn mass murder into an act of tenderness, into the final manifestation of parental love. This is cognitive dissonance in its most extreme form, simultaneously holding two contradictory ideas. I love my child. I'm killing my child. The only way to cope with this contradiction is to redefine murder as something else, as salvation, as protection from a worse fate. Jones gave them this framework, and they accepted it because the alternative, admitting they were killing their children, was unbearable. The children of Jonestown had no choice at all. They were the most innocent victims. Many of them were born in the community, knew no other life. For them, Jones was grandfather. The temple was the only home. Other community members were their family. They trusted the adults who surrounded them, and this trust was betrayed in the most terrible way. The psychological profile of children who grew up in people's temple shows deep trauma. Those few children who survived, either because they were not in Jonestown that day, or because their parents managed to hide them or get them out, suffered from post-traumatic stress, problems with trust, identity. They lost not only parents and friends, but their entire system of understanding the world. One of the surviving children, who was 6 years old during the tragedy, later recounted that until his teenage years he believed he was to blame for the death of his mother and younger sister. He thought that if he had been there, he could have saved them, or conversely, that he should have died with them. This survivor's guilt is a common feature among those who survived Jonestown. Guyanese authorities who first discovered the tragedy site were also deeply traumatized. This was a small country unaccustomed to such events. Soldiers and police who arrived at the scene were not prepared for what they saw. Many of them needed psychological help for years after. The process of removing bodies was a nightmare. In the tropical heat, bodies decomposed quickly. There were not enough coffins, not enough transport. American military were called in to help, and they built a temporary morgue right at the site. Photographs of this process exist, but they're so graphic that most publications refuse to publish them. Media coverage of Jonestown was intense and often sensational. Newspapers published horrifying photos of bodies. Television showed footage again and again. This was one of the first mass tragedies so thoroughly documented and shown to the public. Today, such coverage would be considered unethical, but in 1978, standards were different. Public reaction was a mixture of horror, fascination, and attempts to understand. How could this happen? How could American citizens be drawn into such madness? Many tried to distance themselves, calling the victims weak, stupid, abnormal. This was a defense mechanism. If they were somehow different, then this cannot happen to us. But the truth is that Jonestown victims were ordinary people. Statistics show they represented a cross-section of American society, different races, ages, education levels, socioeconomic statuses. The only thing that united them was the desire to find meaning, community, a better world. These universal human desires were used against them. In the recording of the final minutes, there is a moment of silence that lasts almost a minute. This is after most people have already drunk the poison, but before they all died. In this minute, you can only hear the sounds of the surrounding jungle, birds, insects, wind in the leaves. Life continued around, indifferent to human tragedy. This is an eerie contrast. Nature, calm and eternal, and human suffering, intense and temporary. Then the silence is broken by a sound. Someone is sobbing. These are deep, wrenching sobs of a person who realizes the full scale of what has happened. It's impossible to say who it is, man or woman, young or old. Just a voice of pure grief. Then this too subsides. The last words on the recording belong to one of Jones's assistants. He says something about needing to make sure everyone is dead, that no one should remain to suffer. His voice is businesslike, almost matter of fact, as if he is discussing a routine task. This ordinariness of evil is perhaps the most frightening part of the entire recording. Then the recording breaks off. Someone turned off the tape recorder, or the cassette ended. We will never know what happened in the next minutes or hours. When the guards and last living members of the inner circle also took poison or shot themselves. How Jones himself died. Whether there was a struggle, whether there were last words, last thoughts. The place where Jonestown stood is today almost completely swallowed by jungle. The Guyanese government did not want it to become a pilgrimage site or tourist attraction. Several times attempts were made to create a memorial, but all attempts met resistance. Too much pain is associated with this place. Sometimes survivors or relatives of victims come there. They walk along overgrown paths, trying to find the place where the pavilion stood, where their loved ones died. But the jungle does not keep memory. Nature took back its own, covering the place of tragedy with greenery and life. In the U.S., there are several memorials to Jonestown victims. The largest is at a cemetery in Oakland, California, where hundreds of unidentified and unclaimed bodies are buried. For a long time, no one wanted to take responsibility for these burials. Many families refused to collect their relatives' bodies, partly due to transportation costs, partly due to shame and trauma. The memorial has the names of all the deceased engraved on it. Every year on November 18th, a small group of people gathers there for a memorial service. Survivors come, relatives, researchers, just people who were touched by this story. They light candles, pronounce names, try to preserve the memory of those who died, not as a faceless mass of cultists, but as individual human beings with names, stories, dreams. One of the women who regularly visits this memorial lost her entire family in Jonestown: mother, father, three brothers and sisters. She was 20 years old and was not in Jonestown only because she was studying in college at the time. She learned about the tragedy from television news, saw aerial photographs of bodies, and realized her entire family was dead. She says the hardest thing is living with questions that will never be answered. Did her mother want to die? Did she try to protect the younger children? Did she think about the daughter who remained outside? Or in the final minutes, was she so under Jones's influence that she really believed she was doing the right thing? This uncertainty haunts many survivors. The recording gives some answers, but not all. It shows that many people did not want to die, that there was chaos and fear. But it cannot tell the individual stories of each person, each decision, each last thought. Researchers have spent decades analyzing not only the audio recording, but also letters, diaries, documents left after Jonestown. They tried to reconstruct the complete picture of life in the community, understand the psychological dynamics that led to tragedy. Some of this research led to important discoveries in the field of group psychology, manipulation, trauma. One researcher discovered that Jones kept a personal diary where he recorded his real thoughts without ideological wrapping. In these entries, he admitted he did not believe in God, that religion for him was just a tool of control. He wrote about his contempt for his followers, calling them weak and gullible. At the same time, he demonstrated deep paranoia, conviction that the whole world was against him. These diaries show a person deeply mentally ill, but at the same time perceptive enough to use his understanding of human psychology for manipulation. Jones was not simply insane. He was a calculating predator who used the mask of idealism to satisfy his thirst for power. In recent years, new audio analysis technologies have appeared. Researchers used special software to isolate individual voices on the Jonestown recording, clean them from background noise. This allowed identification of more people hearing words that were previously unintelligible. One such discovery was particularly poignant. Researchers isolated the voice of a little girl who at some point says, "I want to go home." Simple words of a child who does not understand what is happening, who is just tired and scared and wants a safe place. But for her, as for hundreds of other children, home no longer existed. The question of how to classify the deaths in Jonestown remains controversial to this day. Was it mass suicide as Jones claimed, or mass murder? Legally, if a person was forced to die under threat or violence, it is murder, not suicide. Given the number of children who could not give consent, given the presence of armed guards, given evidence of violence, many experts consider it correct to call this mass murder. But for survivors and relatives, this discussion often seems abstract. Their loved ones are dead, and however we call it, it will not bring them back. What really matters to them is making sure the world remembers that their loved ones were victims, not fanatics, that they deserve compassion, not contempt. The media has not always been fair in this regard. Early reports often portrayed People's Temple members as crazed cultists, ignoring the social context that led them to the temple, ignoring the system of control and manipulation that kept them there. Only years later, when more thoughtful studies and documentaries appeared, did public perception begin to change. One of the most important documentaries about Jonestown was made in 2006 by a director who himself grew up in a cold environment and understood the dynamics from the inside. His film showed People's Temple members as full, complex people with hopes and fears, not as caricatures. He included interviews with survivors, Archival footage of the temple's happy times showed the gradual escalation of control. The film used parts of the audio recording of the final minutes, but the director was very careful about how to do this. He did not use the most graphic moments, the screams of children. He understood there's a line between documenting history and exploiting tragedy. This ethical dilemma faces everyone who works with Jonestown materials. The full audio recording is available in archives for researchers, but there are ongoing debates about whether it should be publicly accessible. Arguments for historical importance, educational value, society's right to know the truth. Arguments against respect for victims and their families. Danger that the recording could be misused, for example, as entertainment for fans of horrific stories. In the internet era, there are sites where you can find the full recording. Every year, especially around the anniversary of the tragedy, discussions emerge about whether this is right. Survivors and relatives of victims often speak out against distribution of the recording, saying it turns the final minutes of their loved ones into spectacle. But there is another point of view. Some cult experts believe the recording has enormous educational value. It shows mechanisms of manipulation in action, demonstrates how a charismatic leader can drive people to the unthinkable. For those who work with cult victims or try to prevent people's involvement in destructive groups, this recording is an important tool. One organization that helps people exit cults uses excerpts from the recording in its educational programs. Not the most graphic parts, but moments where Jones's manipulation is heard, where people try to object but are drowned out. This helps people who have been in similar groups see patterns they experienced, understand they are not alone. Psychologists also study the recording from a professional perspective. It provides a unique opportunity to hear mass psychology in action, understand how groupthink works in extreme situations. Such research helps in developing methods to counter manipulation, in creating recovery programs for cult victims. Interestingly, some techniques Jones used are still used today, but in less extreme forms. Marketing, political propaganda, even some management methods use elements of the same thing. Creating an us versus them group, appealing to fear, promising simple solutions to complex problems, demanding loyalty without questions. The difference is in degree, but not in nature. Jonestown is an extreme example of what happens when these techniques are taken to their logical limit, when there are no checks and balances, when people are completely isolated from alternative viewpoints. In the modern world, with the internet and social media, one might think such isolation is impossible. But experts warn that new technologies create new possibilities for manipulation. Online cults, social media echo chambers, disinformation campaigns. These are all modern versions of the same mind control techniques. The recording of Jonestown's final minutes remains one of the darkest documents of the 20th century, but it also serves as an important reminder about the fragility of the human psyche and how important it is to maintain critical thinking even in the face of charismatic leaders and attractive ideologies. When we listen to these voices from the past, voices of people in their final minutes, we must remember that these were not weak or stupid people. These were teachers, nurses, activists, parents, children. People who wanted to make the world better, who sought meaning and community. Their tragedy is that these noble aspirations were used against them in a monstrous way. Today, more than 45 years after the tragedy, there are fewer and fewer survivors. Time does its work, but the memory of Jonestown must live not as a source of horror or entertainment, but as a lesson about what can happen when we stop asking questions, when we give our capacity for critical thinking to someone else, when we allow fear to control our decisions. In that recording, among the screams and crying, among Jones's manipulative speeches, there are moments of true humanity. Mothers comforting their children, people holding hands in the final minutes, those who found courage to object, even knowing it was useless. These moments show that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit retains a spark of resistance, a spark of love, a spark of hope. 909 people died that day. 314 of them were children. Each of them had a name, a story, dreams of the future. They were not statistics. They were people whose lives were stolen by the madness of one man and the system he created. When we speak about Jonestown, when we listen to this recording, we must do so with respect for the memory of the victims, but also with determination to never allow such a thing to happen again. We must be vigilant for signs of manipulation in our own lives, in politics, in religion, in any sphere where someone demands our unconditional submission. Jim Jones is dead, but the techniques he used are alive. They evolve, adapt to new times, new technologies. Our defense against them is education, critical thinking, maintaining connections with diverse viewpoints, and willingness to ask uncomfortable questions even of those we respect. The final recording of Jonestown is not just a historical curiosity or subject for morbid curiosity. It is a cry from the past, a warning for the future. It is the voices of people who paid the highest price for their trust and who now, through the decades, still speak to us, begging us to be wiser, to be more careful, to be more human. Let their voices not be forgotten. Let their death not be in vain. Let the memory of Jonestown serve as an eternal reminder that freedom of thought is the most precious thing we have, and that we must defend it at any cost. November 18th, 1978. The day hope died in the jungles of Guyana. The day that should make each of us think about the nature of power, faith, and human vulnerability. The day we must not forget. This has been the Fear Files channel. Remember this story, learn from it, and never allow such a thing to happen again. Thank you for being with us today on this difficult but important journey into one of the darkest chapters of human history. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Ask questions, think critically, and remember, true strength lies in the ability to say no, even when everyone around is saying yes. Until we meet again on the Fear Files channel.